barriers. I've had a little bit of problem this morning with the stream picture identification. Sorry. You are listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered. Jack Stockwell, that's me. And sitting here at the beginning of Monday with tremendous events unfolding, even as of today, between two big presidents, President Trump, President Putin. And their, not summit, but their meeting that's going to take place today. And then also several other things to talk about, just bringing things up to date, but that now Donald Trump now owns the Ukraine war. I want to get into that a little bit because what happens after today can help issue the United States into a security agreement with Russia, with China, and for world peace, or it can take us a step further away. So I want to talk about that as well, and I want to talk about never letting anyone ever forget for 1 minute what they did to Gaza and the situation that that's in at the moment. It is the 19th day of May, and if the talks have any chance of succeeding that are going to take, they may already be underway because of the time offset, but the American side, President Trump, has to admit that the United States started the war and has fueled the war, and the United States could have ended the war on Inauguration Day last January. Now, the talks in Istanbul that were going on this last week might provide some bit of a prospect for peace. I think it bears emphasizing that the 3-year proxy war could have been avoided altogether if diplomacy had been permitted by Washington in early 2022 instead of being sabotaged. This didn't need to happen. And so after 3 years now, we have a new president and appears to be somewhat of a more enlightened policy. Or maybe it's just an implicit admission that the U.S. proxy war agenda is a failure. It's collapsed on its face and it just can't go on any longer, even though we have to admit it was a proxy war against Russia. Now, in any case, Trump and his envoys, as of this weekend, have been unequivocally saying that they want to stop the bloodshed in the Ukraine, which is obviously a very big change from his predecessor, Joe Biden, who vowed to back Ukraine for, I think he said, for as long as it takes in this fantastical, reckless pursuit of actually believing to the death of 1 million people so far that somehow Ukraine could strategically defeat Russia. It was the Biden administration, along with the British government, that intervened to scuttle the peace talks that began in March of 2022, less than a month after the special military operation began. And Washington and London coaxed the Kyiv regime to keep fighting with promises of more and more weapons. And again, at this point, you ask the question, who stood to gain from that? You know, other than the military-industrial complex. So 3 more years of intense conflict, which have caused millions of casualties, mainly on the Ukrainian side. The proxy war has come perilously close to provoking an all-out world war between nuclear powers. And Trump appears to want peace, and if he's genuine in that admission, then he's going to have to he's going to have to address the root causes of the conflict. Russia has consistently explained the deeper causes of NATO aggression and the militarization of the Ukraine as a hostile bridgehead on its borders since the CIA orchestrated coup back in 2014 in Kyiv. And the American president has shown some petulance at times, urging Ukraine and Russia to get down to a peace deal. He's even threatened Russia with more economic sanctions, futile as they've been and would be. But what the Trump administration needs to understand is that resolving the deep conflicts requires commensurate negotiations and a realistic commitment to some lasting geopolitical security agreements. So the talks in Istanbul this week to try to come to some kind of a peaceful resolution were initiated by Russian President Putin. And Russia's delegation was led by his senior aide, Vladimir Medinsky, which speaks of consistency and commitment because Medinsky led the peace talks 3 years ago in Istanbul, which were then sabotaged the following month in April by the American and British intervention with their ridiculous puppet, Bojo, going over to Kyiv to ensure Zelensky that he would have all of the power and the money needed to defeat Russia. I can't get it out of my mouth without laughing. So it's not clear if follow-up meetings are going to take place, but at least you might say that the talks took place. So the key to any prospect of ending this conflict depends on Washington demonstrating the requisite commitment. And Trump said this last week, that he would like to hold a summit with Putin as soon as possible. And the Kremlin also said that a formal presidential meeting is desirable. So the Kremlin spokesman, Peskov, said that there has to be adequate preparation for some meaningful discussions that implies that any top-level meeting must be cognizant of Russia's demands for a resolution, one that deals with history and the systematic causes of this proxy war. Not just, well, we ought to just stop shooting at each other. No, 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 no. You have to go to the cause of it. So Western politicians and the media, of course, are denying Russia's perspective. They're saying that what Russia wants, what Russia is demanding in the sense of bringing this to an end is totally delusional and duplicitous as a stall before he invades all of Europe. And to claim that the conflict is all about unprovoked Russian aggression against democratic Ukraine and Russian expansionism towards Europe from the Russian point of view, of course, is a total travesty. And it's a bogus narrative that precludes a peaceful resolution because Trump seems to be aware of this. But he needs to go beyond this superficial peace broker charade. Because if Trump wants a gimmicky big summit with Putin for his PR ratings, as his tour of the Middle East this week illustrates his egotistical want to some degree, I think everything that happened in the Middle East, if Trump can't get his ego out of the way, he can forget it. Because the meeting this week in Turkey can be seen as some preliminary technical discussions. However, President Trump needs to take the lead. I mean, appropriately, a peaceful resolution is only going to happen if at the senior level of U.S. and Russian governments. That's because the United States is the primary protagonist in the proxy war against Russia. Now, just imagine yourself being a fly on the wall at this meeting today. And I still don't know if it's face-to-face or over the phone. But whatever, imagine you being able to listen to this, and you have, on the one side, President Putin who has won the war. In fact, their aggression is getting even tougher now. And some of the critics are saying, well, if he really wants peace talks, he wouldn't be doing all this mass drone attacking on Ukraine or Kyiv that just happened. Well, they're not giving up their military positions, and there's not going to be a ceasefire. The idea that you have to have a ceasefire before you have peace talks is silly. You can talk peace at the same time you're shooting. That may sound counterintuitive, but no, as long as you're winning, you're not about to back down and turn direction and give the other side a chance to rearm. That's ridiculous. So I think it's clear from the antics and the theatrics of Kyiv regime this week that there's no prospect of a lasting peace if negotiations are confined to the level where you start with a ceasefire. So Zelensky doesn't even have the constitutional legitimacy after canceling elections last year to even represent the thing. And his erratic behavior of grandstanding and mudslinging at the Russian diplomatic efforts proves that he's simply not capable of any substantive negotiations. No wonder Trump or Putin doesn't want to talk to him. So the European leaders are also an impediment to achieving some authentic peace settlement. Even before the delegations met this week in Istanbul, a lot of the non-entity European politicians were disparaging Russia's diplomatic initiative. Macron, Starmer, Merz, von der Leyen, Callas, Tusk, just desperately trying to outdo one another to insult the Russian president, indulging Zelensky's PR stunt, demanding a face-to-face meeting with Putin in Istanbul. Gee whiz. It never ceases to crack me up. The kind of charade, the story, the kabuki theater that Zelensky seems to be leading. So the European Union also has timed an announcement this week to double its supply of heavy caliber munitions to Ukraine. Another provocation. And France's Macron, see, now that's not why, it's one of the reasons why Putin's not about to agree to a ceasefire. At the same time, the European Union says we're going to double the heavy artillery, which has been the Russian position. If you have a ceasefire, they're going to double their military supply. So France's Macron tried to impose a precondition for the talks by demanding this 30-day ceasefire, which is a flagrant attempt to sabotage the negotiations even before they begin. These people are not honest whatsoever about ending the worst war in Europe since the end of World War II. And disgracefully, they want the bloodshed to continue for their own political survival and gratifying their obsessive Russophobia fantasies. If Trump wants to end NATO's proxy war with Russia, he's going to have to sideline the European naysayers and the puppet regime in Kyiv because their involvement is simply counterproductive. And I think that Trump already knows that. An American and Russian agreement at the highest level is the only way to bring the war to an end. And it's no use for the American side to go on pretending that they're peace brokers, because the American side is the main protagonist. Now I need to mute K-Talk while they go to break. And so that's what seems so silly to me, and I'm talking to the streamers. That's what seems so, excuse me. What is so silly is the is that you're going to have these two great nation presidents sit down and talk to one another about what they're going to do with this war when one side is winning and the other side is the main protagonist. I talked to somebody over the weekend about that. And I had to talk to him for about 20 minutes before they finally understood that. This war could have ended the afternoon of Trump's inauguration by his shutting down all weapons and all money. And so there was an initial attempt to do that, but it was reinstated very quickly thereafter. And so you have Putin and Trump on the phone or face-to-face or whatever, and they've seemed to demonstrate when they were in the presence of one another years ago some degree of mutual respect. But again, at the risk of repeating myself several times this morning, you have the situation where one of them has won the war and the other one is the main protagonist. Not the European lapdogs, not the Kyiv regime. And so now you have a different administration that has different priorities. And it was Biden's dream war that provided this nightmare that has given us this nightmare in the first place. So preliminary talks are all very well, but they're just that. And in seeing it that way, you know, if the talks at all have any chance of succeeding, the American side has to take responsibility for starting the war and for fueling the war. So I just wanted to mention that. I've got several other things that I want to get into. But along this same line, this planet, regardless of what continent you're looking at, including Antarctica, simply needs a new paradigm for security and development. Now, those living in NATO land are told that the talks are useless since Putin will not agree to a ceasefire. And Putin has been clear all along that he wants a successful resolution to the root cause of the conflict, and a ceasefire is not necessarily a step in that direction. As his chief negotiator in Istanbul, Medinsky, and he was the chief negotiator 3 years ago in Istanbul, he said it's not uncommon for negotiations to take place under the conditions of fighting. And those living in NATO land are told that after calling for negotiations, Putin did not show up in Istanbul. But he never said he was going to go to Istanbul. He called for a resumption of the negotiations that were called off back in April 2022 under pressure from Bojo, Boris Johnson, and he appointed 2 of the 2022 negotiators to the talks this last week in Istanbul. And meanwhile, Russia has acknowledged the constructive role played by the United States leading up to this in encouraging Zelensky to finally resume these negotiations. But it's also the fact that the war has continued because of the United States' involvement. And then consider the negotiations going on at the same time with Iran. I mean, it's useful that President Trump has not given Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu what he wants. And Netanyahu wants war with Iran every bit as much as the Western Four Stooges want war with Russia. But demands for Iran to completely give up uranium enrichment, which Trump sometimes calls for and sometimes he doesn't, is not the path to peace. It took far longer than it should have to reach a nuclear deal with Iran in the form of the JCPOA. back in 2003, Iran proposed a comprehensive deal which would have limited but not ended its enrichment capacity. And at the time, it had under 200 centrifuges. And then the Bush administration ignored that proposal in 2003. And by 2006, Iran had gone from 200 centrifuges to over 3,000 centrifuges. And the Bush administration finally agreed to engage in talks, but made an impossible demand that Iran stop all enrichment before the talks begin. In 2009, Iran had gone from 3,000 to 8,000 centrifuges and had stockpiled over a ton of low-enriched uranium. And by the time the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, was implemented, Iran had 19,000 centrifuges and 10 tons of low-enriched uranium. Now, in conjunction with all of this, when I'm talking about a new paradigm, look at the genocide in Israel that's being conducted in Gaza. The Times of London reports on a leaked Israeli map that proposes splitting Gaza into three sections: a northern section, a middle one, and a southern one. And a very wide Israeli army corridor between each section, and Palestinians cannot cross from one zone to another except with Israeli permission. Now, if that's not a concentration camp, I don't know what is. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's announcement that he's going to go ahead and resume humanitarian aid to Gaza, in a very limited way, mind you, has provoked waves of anger from elements inside of Israel who are even more insane than he is. The National Security Minister, Ben Gvir, said this: "Every humanitarian aid that enters the Strip, and definitely all parts of it, will fuel Hamas and give it oxygen while our hostages languish in tunnels." And then another member of his party referred to Netanyahu as, quote, "a leader who could have led to a clear victory and been remembered as one of those who defeated radical Islam, but who, time after time, let this historic opportunity slip away. Letting humanitarian aid in now directly harms the war effort to achieve victory." So in the name of continuing to starve innocent Palestinians, and I saw one report that indicated the starvation will be over with probably within 2 weeks. And by I mean over with, those who are being starved to death will all be dead by then, within 2 weeks of starvation. Now, as a anti-genocide commencement address at George Washington University, and the response indicates the future belongs to the peacemakers, not the murderers, because a commencement speaker at New York University, whose address was on the same theme, was informed that his diploma was being withheld. He gets up and talks about, in the commencement at New York University, trying to bring to the attention of the audience the horrors of the genocide, the bombing of hospitals and schools, the bombing of non-combatant communities and tents and retreats, the cutting off of water, the cutting off of food, the cutting off of medical help and assistance, the cutting off of emergency care to children who actually survived the bombing. Because he got up and talked about that, the school is going to withhold his diploma. So, with that, I want to start the program. What is going on in Gaza, what is going on with Iran, and what is going on in Ukraine, and those events that are kind of steamrolling this Monday, 19th of May, a week away from Memorial Day, 2025. Now, Russian President aide Vladimir Medinsky, that I was talking about a moment ago, who's the chief negotiator in the meetings between Ukraine and Russian representatives at the Istanbul talks, conducted an interview Friday on the Russia 1 TV channel with AI-generated English audio translation, which is getting better all the time. I always wondered how they could, when you see a live interview and in some foreign language, and the English translation is going across the bottom of the screen as fast as they're speaking. I thought, man, that is one learned interpreter. No, it's AI that's doing it. And AI is getting better at it all the time. But he said that at the negotiations, it was important to remind Ukraine about the agreements reached in Gomel and Belarus and Istanbul in February and March of 2022. And those agreements included Ukraine renouncing its efforts to join NATO, becoming permanently neutral and not joining any military alliance, and restoring the Russian language as the official state language, one of the official state languages in the Ukraine on equal footing with Ukrainian, among other stipulations, because there's millions of ethnic Russians living in the Ukraine that were being shelled, bombed, targeted by Ukrainian forces from 2014 up to 2022. Their language was suppressed and made illegal, and their church was banned in an effort to root out, silly as it sounds, Russian culture and heritage. So in the interview Friday, Medinsky said it was the key topic, the non-militarization of Ukraine and restoring Russian as one of the main languages of the Ukraine. He said it was the key topic because we are considering the talks of the resumption of the Istanbul process. I'm quoting him. So it was important to reiterate what we agreed on in Gomel back at the end of February and how all of this would have ended had Ukraine agreed to a peace deal at the end of February. They did not agree. They were dragging their feet, and after the next stage of agreements was in Istanbul. Then he pointed out how common it actually is to negotiate during fighting, not only in a condition of ceasefire. So he cited several historical examples of the West's direct interference, at the time primarily between France and Britain, which had resulted in wars such as the interference of the peace treaty of San Stefano, which triggered the Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913, and World War I in 1914, 1918. And those who don't understand history believe that there has to be first a ceasefire, he said, and then peace negotiations can begin. But in fact, he said, in history, war and negotiations can occur simultaneously. And as a stark example of the usual results of Western meddling, he revealed the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1721 between Tsarist Russia, led by Peter the Great, and the Swedish Empire, led by Charles XII. And not long after the fighting began, Peter the Great offered a peace agreement which would give Russia access to the Baltic Sea and control of St. Petersburg that at the time Sweden controlled, with some of the surrounding area to go along with it. But Sweden, egged on by Britain and France, kept the fighting going for another 21 years, at the end of which Sweden lost tremendous amounts of land to Russia and has never again been seen as any kind of a great European empire that it was then. So what do you think that implies for Ukraine in the coming negotiations, when one has clearly won the war and the other one has clearly lost it, and is lucky if they don't end up on the gallows? for their war crimes. Now, another thing I wanted to, I'm going to get into more of that, but I got some notes here I don't want to miss out on. And that is on May 9th, and you may have heard the live or the replay of Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller telling reporters that the Trump administration was considering suspending the right to habeas corpus, which is the right of a detained person to access the judicial system to challenge their detention. That's simply what habeas corpus, if I understand the Latin correctly, is to bring the body, and would mean to bring the body before the court. So someone who has been detained by some law enforcement group, the right of habeas corpus, Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution, shall not be, denied, limited, whatever, except in case of invasion or revolution or something like that. I'll have to look it up. I think the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of a rebellion or invasion or public safety or something, may demand it or something like that. So I'm bringing this up because most legal authorities that have made comments about this have considered it clear that this right can only be suspended by Congress, not the president. And why is this an issue? Because when you're gathering up people in this country who are illegally here, who have committed crimes, not the least of which is murder, and they are demanding the right of habeas corpus, in other words, to have representation before the court and to let the court decide whether they can be thrown out of the country or not. And the president is saying in this particular case, he's going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And so these experts are saying, that's not the power of the executive, that's the power of the legislative branch. The Constitution is really kind of clear on the matter, and of course that is the supreme law of our land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion, but that's an option, Stephen Miller says, that we are looking at closely, actively. He said, look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not, suggesting that if the courts don't decide the way that Trump wants them to decide, then the courts will be removed from the equation altogether, and without habeas corpus, a person can be detained indefinitely without trial or other due process. And remember, some of the Arabs and the Islamic terrorists and whatever else in America that were gathered up and thrown in Guantanamo and picked up in other parts of the world and brought to Guantanamo over 20 years ago were denied the writ of habeas corpus. So the right appears in, I think I said Section 8, I think it's Section 9, Article 1, Section 9. And it's dealing with the powers of the legislative branch. Now, it doesn't specifically say that only Congress can suspend the writ of habeas corpus. It just mentions in Article 1, which is about the legislative branch of government. Article 2, of course, is the executive. Article 3 is the judicial. But because it's listed in the legislative Article 1 section, it's assumed that only Congress can do that. Now, Antonin Scalia, in his dissent to Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, a case which challenged George W. Bush's claims that he could detain any U.S. citizen as an enemy combatant without any access to due process, Scalia said, although the Constitution does not state that suspension must be effected by or authorized by a legislative act, it has been so understood, consistent with English practice, and the clause's placement in Article 1. Now, the Supreme Court did not go far enough in limiting the president and ensuring habeas corpus, argued Scalia. But Amy Coney Barrett, who was appointed by Trump several years ago, she says this: the clause does not specify which branch of government has the authority to suspend the privilege of the writ, but most agree that only Congress can do it. Although President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus unilaterally during the Civil War, she says the Congress followed by enacting legislation to temporarily suspend it. She said on every occasion, the executive has proceeded only after first securing congressional authorization. The writ of habeas corpus has been suspended only 4 times since the Constitution was ratified. Extraordinary is the word that Amy Coney Barrett used to describe the power conferred by a suspension of habeas corpus. When a suspension is in effect, the president, typically acting through subordinates, can imprison people indefinitely without any judicial check. So no wonder she used the word extraordinary. That is an extraordinary power. So regardless, in the case of an American citizen who may have committed the most heinous of crimes, can't be left in jail indefinitely. That's simply what habeas corpus means. They have a right to appear before the judge and plead, guilty or not guilty. Once they're charged with a crime, to take that right away when you're dealing with 320 million people, with the idea that it only applies to those who are not American citizens, would only be applied against those who are here illegally and those that ICE or Border Patrol or whoever had investigated and found involved in crimes. I think it would be a difficult thing to do. However, the president on again and off again about it. I'm not aware of any firm decision that's been made. Now, a couple of comments about a historian, a German historian in the Holocaust. I just came across this. On May 13th, historian Tariq Cyril Amar criticized a Berlin event at which the state-funded German-Israeli Society held an Israel Day celebration in late April. And a Jewish restaurant called Feinberg's displayed a poster promoting a watermelon smoothie that would have been enough to turn any decent person's stomach. Because the poster showed a lion, a symbol of Israel, holding drinks made from watermelons. Watermelons are a symbol of Palestinian identity. And the background consisted of a pile of watermelons, all cut open, many featuring instantly recognizable baby faces. And the poster text said, partly in English, partly in German, "Watermelon meets Zion. Israeli-style watermelon shredded, mashed, and hacked to pieces." Oh my goodness. So this Amar said the poster was, of course, an unmistakable allusion to Israel's ongoing combined genocide ethnic cleansing operation, with its main, though not the sole, target, the Palestinians in Gaza. That's the place where the majority of Israel's victims, many of them babies and children, have literally been shredded and cut to pieces. And it's Gaza under Israeli assault for which doctors had to invent a new abbreviation, WCNSF, wounded child, no surviving family. Then Amar concluded by posing the question, what is intriguing is that this time there have been some protests, even if all too faintly, in some mainstream media outlets. Maybe Germany is not entirely lost yet. Or is it, as before in German history, only a minority that shows decency can change the deeply indecent course of the country's morally and intellectually kaput elites, and the majority still following them? Amar is a historian of the 20th century, specializing in the Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. But did you follow what I'm talking about there, this restaurant? This restaurant is showing watermelon smoothies. Watermelon is a symbol of Gaza. And in some of the hacked up pieces of watermelon that was going into the smoothies had faces of Palestinian children. I don't know how that kind of stuff makes it into the window of a restaurant, except that it's a Jewish restaurant. All right. In any case, there is this meeting between the Russian and the Ukrainian delegations this last week was moderated by the Turkish foreign minister. And the meeting ended after 2 hours. I've heard some scuttle about it, but we still don't know the complete results of that discussion. We'll find out more. And then Paul just sent me this. Well, that's the authority to suspend habeas corpus comes from U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2, called the Suspension Clause. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Well, you know what Trump has taken, the invasion argument. Key points, textual authority. The Constitution allows for the suspension of habeas corpus only under specific circumstances: rebellion, as in the case of civil war; invasion, as in the case of foreign troops on U.S. soil. It does not say who can suspend it, who has the power, and that's been the debate. Article 1 deals with Congress, suggesting Congress holds the power to suspend habeas corpus. However, President Lincoln unilaterally suspended in 1861, arguing his executive wartime powers justified it. In Ex parte, Merriman, 1861, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that only Congress can suspend the writ. Lincoln defied the ruling, arguing necessity due to rebellion. Later in 1863, Congress passed the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act, giving Lincoln retroactive legal cover. Modern interpretations, Supreme Court rulings have upheld that even during wartime, habeas corpus applies unless suspension is lawfully invoked. The Boumediene versus Bush 2008 decision reaffirmed that Congress cannot eliminate habeas corpus without proper constitutional justification. So what does it mean? The Constitution allows suspension of habeas corpus only in cases of rebellion or invasion, but leaves ambiguous whether Congress or the President has the authority to suspend it. Historically, Congress has been viewed as having the legitimate constitutional authority, though presidents have acted unilaterally in times of crisis. Thanks, Paul. I appreciate that. So, in any case, back to this talk between the two presidents today, Trump and Putin. There's a lot of international drama, of course, surrounding it. Everybody in the West was saying that had Putin showed up at this thing in Istanbul this last week, it would have been a trap for Putin. And of course, Putin didn't show up. So, leaving all theatrics aside, I think it's very important that meeting took place, because the meeting today, I don't think, would be taking place without that one having taken place. And it's the first direct discussions between the Ukrainians and the Russians since March of 2022, when also in Istanbul, they had reached an agreement that would have ended the war within 1 month. And of course, that agreement was sabotaged by Boris Johnson, who flew into Kyiv in order to tell Zelensky that he should keep up the fighting and that all of NATO, with everything they had to add to the fight, would back him up. And if you consider the enormous number of people who have lost their lives, what an enormous destruction of Ukraine has occurred, this is simply incredible. Therefore, it's important that these direct negotiations are taking place. Now, the Russian delegation consisted of exactly the same team that negotiated 3 years ago in March of 2022. Therefore, they obviously know the territory very well, and they knew the ins and outs of difficulties and were, at the very least, highly experienced in this. Zelensky denounced the delegation, saying it was just too low-key, and Putin didn't show up, so it doesn't matter. But the Ukrainian delegation, according to some reports from Russian sources, was not a very experienced team. The composition of the team was which was very large, the Ukrainian delegation was very large, consisted of about 80% security officials of different types and about 20% of politicians and diplomats. So you can figure out the composition of the mindset from the beginning if 80% are security people. I mean, in any case, you can expect that the real result is only going to come from a direct meeting between Trump and Putin. And Putin said yesterday that he wants this meeting set up as quickly as possible. So I think the major hopeful sign that this is going to come to an end, I think that the overall dynamic is actually going in the direction of settling these conflicts. This is unfortunately not applying for everything. It for sure does not apply to the situation in Gaza, whereas of now, the genocide is in full motion forward. Tom Fletcher, who's the Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations, just made a statement saying that the International Court of Justice is reviewing to see if there's any genocide going on. He said if they don't hurry up, it's going to be too late because no one will be left alive to find out if genocide is going on. As a matter of fact, in the meantime, more than 60-day complete shutoff of aid to Gaza means that 2 days ago, Phase 5 starvation level was true for 22% of all the people in Gaza. Phase 4, which is just below immediate starvation but still famine, is remaining for the 80%. Did you hear what I just said? How this is calculated? So basically, an unbelievable ratio of dying is going on as a result of hunger and thirst and disease, while we, the Americans, are supporting this. And what is being acted out right now is exactly to the letter what the defense minister of Israel said on the 9th of October, 19 months ago, that there would be a total siege of Gaza because what Israel is confronted with would be human animals. And obviously that would be enough to dehumanize the entire campaign. So the situation is beyond description. I think the words of Tom Fletcher that our present world is going to be judged by future generations, and nobody can say we did all that we could, because it would be enough to do one single phone call from President Trump to stop this. So the burden of action is on you and me, on the world community, but especially, obviously, those whose powers could change it with very little effort by picking up the phone, blowing the whistle, okay, Bibi, out of the pool. All money, all weapons, stop right now. And any movement by the IDF to continue to kill, murder, snipe humanitarian aid workers will be judged with, will be responded accordingly by the American Air Force. So the situation there remains one of an acute emergency. And now the IDF has extended what they're doing in Gaza to the West Bank. And there was an incident where a bomb attack occurred against a car with a pregnant woman who was killed. And that was the starting point for the Israeli military to announce that they would level to the ground all the refugee camps and villages where suspected terrorists were hiding. So we now have an extension of genocide now of Gaza into the West Bank. So that is obviously the burning issue that has to change. Otherwise, I would say that President Trump's efforts may sound very difficult to understand because of his obvious zigzagging tendencies of saying one thing one day and the next day saying something completely different. But if there's any hope, I think one can conclude from the fact that the Geneva discussions going on between the United States and China on the tariffs resulted only a very short period of negotiations with a positive result. Almost all the tariffs were taken back, going down to about 10%, which is a minor amount. The Chinese evaluation was that it was a surprising success, a stunning reversal surpassing the most optimistic of projections, one rare moment of détente in an ocean of tension and friction. So say the Chinese. The U.S. tariffs on Chinese products, if you remember, which were in some categories up to 245%. Everything's been taken back. And obviously the comment by the Chinese was that after negotiation, it turned out that the difficulties were not quite as big as originally expected. Well, one would hope that it's also the case for the settlement of the Ukrainian issue, given the situation on the battlefield, despite the fact that the Ukrainians mount here and there another attack. And they're generally clearly defeated already. And all the efforts by the so-called coalition of the willing to prop up their fighting capability isn't going to result in a change of the war situation, which is lost. Ukraine has lost this war. So now the only question can be the denying be ended. Stop the denying. I mean, the coalition of the willing clearly has not yet capitulated to stop their efforts to sabotage this effort. So in conjunction with that, I mean, the coalition of the willing, of course, you know, Great Britain, France, Germany, a couple more. Who else is in there? I don't think it's Italy. Well, it doesn't matter. In Germany, just a little update there. The Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, originally had said in a TV interview that Zelensky can completely have confidence with respect of the delivery of the Taurus missile with MERS. Then the Social Democrats protested, said that they have not reversed their position and will not agree to the delivery of the Taurus because they don't want Germany to become a war party. It's enough for Germany to be a genocide party. They don't want to become a war party. After that, MERS toned excuse me, MERS toned it down a bit, saying that that's not all that an acute question right now. But in any case, if it comes up in the future, he says he's not going to discuss it publicly because you shouldn't discuss things like this out in the open. Yeah. You shouldn't discuss whether you're going to make the nation of Germany a nuclear target of Russia by secretly talking about the delivery of the Taurus missile. And what's different about the Taurus than the British missile and the regular U.S. cruise missiles? Because the Taurus can be nuclear equipped. That's the big difference. You can put a nuclear warhead in the Taurus, and it can fly 500 kilometers. And depending on where it's launched inside of the Ukraine. And remember, Ukraine's as big as Texas. Depending on where it's launched, it could easily reach the Kremlin with a nuclear warhead. Now, regardless of where you stand in all of this, just imagine yourself as Putin, considering the possibility that a cruise missile that does have variability in its flight patterns can avoid anti-missile detection or operation to some degree, is carrying a nuke, and from 5 or 6 minutes from launch could hit the Kremlin with whoever knows what side. I mean, the Kremlin would be gone. What are you, as Putin, going to do to defend your nation against that? Because you know what he's already said. If you pull a stunt like that, Germany is now a nuclear target. And that's not the launching of a Taurus missile. That's just based on the delivery of a Taurus missile. Now, I think Germany needs to be put on alert because this would put Germany into the position of being a full-blown war party member. And as several Russian experts have said, the certain response from the Russians would be to hit an equivalent target in Germany, maybe bridges, because as the German war party has talked about, the only targets they have actually discussed is the Kerch Bridge, the bridge to Crimea. And if it's hit by a Taurus, maybe the factory where the Taurus missiles are produced would become an immediate target for the Russians inside territorial Germany. And then you'd end up with a full shooting war in the center of Europe between Germany and Russia. And that danger has not yet been ruled out until there's a settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, which addresses, as the Russians have said many times, the root causes, which is the extension of NATO and offensive weapons on the territory of Ukraine, which obviously threatened the national security of Russia. Well, these are some of the developments that are going on here this Monday morning, May 19. I would just like to mention two things which are kept in mind. Two things which I think we ought to talk about, because we're not yet in safe quarters by any means. There's a very astonishing, very stunning, and I expect to hear an awful lot more about this absolutely stunning video by Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, who's being asked by a reporter if her accusations against Comey, who's being the former FBI director, that he was propagandizing the assassination of President Trump. that if she would stick to that. And she said she would, because Comey apparently promoted or distributed this ominous sign, which is being used as a symbol for assassination, 8647. 86 meaning a sign for assassination, and Trump the 47th president. Now, anybody who's worked in the restaurant knows what 86 means. I was, during my undergraduate, I was a restaurant manager in Provo of a JB's there on University Avenue in Provo. And when you run out of something, you let the staff, the servers anyway, know, well, we just 86'd, the spaghetti and meatballs, or we just 86'd the garlic bread, or we just 86, whatever. Because you run out of it. And it's towards the end of the day anyway, so you don't worry that much about it. But it also means that you can 86 a customer. If you've got somebody that's unruly, or you don't want them in your restaurant anymore, you would 86 them. This person's been 86'd. So Tulsi Gabbard says that she is going to follow up on this as far as she possibly can, because in this case, 86 means assassination, and 47 means President Trump. There was also yesterday in the British press a similar ominous article saying it's just a question of time when Putin himself is going to be assassinated. So I'm just mentioning these two things because we're not yet in safe waters. And even if we can diffuse the immediate crisis spots in Ukraine and the tariff war, and then obviously something has got to be done about Gaza, especially in the sense of some new security agreement, that it could spread quickly throughout the whole world, because so many people, especially the new Pope, Pope Leo the 14th, in his first address, coming out, peace be unto all of you. Peace, peace, peace. All right. I was going to say something here about Africa, only in the sense that there's over 600 million Africans with no access to electricity. Almost twice the population of the United States in Africa with no access to electricity. And so, and of course this has been the policy of the Western nations, to maintain colonialism, to keep these colonies pumping the raw materials, not for their own good, but for the good of Western industry. And there is development in that particular area now because of the Chinese, because of the Russians, with something as simple as the fourth generation nuclear plants, either thorium or the pebble bed or whatever safe reactors. But Africa urgently needs an infrastructural grid of ports, railroads, fast train systems, highways, industrial parks. And the stuff is sitting there waiting to be developed. The Inga Dam in Congo could supply electricity for the entire region. Then there's the Transakwa program, which would take 3 to 5% of the water from the Congo River at the 500-meter level. And then through a system of canals and rivers, you just transport that water to Lake Chad, which is only about 10% of it left. And then you'd have hydroelectric power all along the canals and the rivers. So and it would take a couple of decades, but this could be done. And so I try to look at all of mankind, not just my fellow Americans, in the sense of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So one more thing, there's another thing I want to jump into, and I think I want to say a little bit more about Comey. I've got some more notes. I kind of ran over that fast. On May 15th, which was Thursday, Tulsi Gabbard called for the arrest of James Comey. She didn't just say this was a bad thing. She wants James Comey arrested. Announcing in an interview with Fox News that the Department of Homeland Security had just launched an investigation into the former FBI director, insisting that Comey be held fully accountable under U.S. law for essentially issuing a call to assassinate President Trump. And she said that she believes that Comey right now belongs behind bars. President Trump echoed Gabbard saying of Comey, Trump said he knew exactly what that meant. He said a child knows what that meant. And if you're the FBI director and you don't know what that meant, that it meant assassination, it said it loud and clear. So such an investigation of a former FBI director is kind of unprecedented in recent U.S. history, let alone calling for the assassination of the president by a former FBI director. Comey's also widely reported to have been a guiding force in the Russiagate fraud concocted to discredit President Trump during his first term. So a few days prior to Gabbard's response, the New York Times reported that she had taken direct control of the presidential daily briefing out of the hands of the CIA, where it was being produced, and centered it in the office of the National Intelligence, whose responsibility it is to provide the crucial daily briefing to the president. Now think about that for a minute. I mean, what agency, what group has been behind for decades the subterfuge going on in other nations to make sure that those nations' borders stay open to American industry in the sense of taking their natural resources and keeping internal development in total disruption in these countries through one civil war after another, sponsored by, supplied by, paid for by this particular agency in the intelligence apparatus of the United States government. You know who I'm talking about. So now, Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, has taken away from the CIA the responsibility of producing the president's daily security update with the Director of National Intelligence herself. Now, what the gravity of Gabbard's and Trump's public charges of Comey come to, along with Gabbard's reorganization of the intelligence structure, is the likelihood that there well could be another live assassination attempt of Trump in the works with the complicity of elements of the establishment. Why would anybody think that that could possibly be out of the realm of reality? It's exactly what happened with Kennedy when he got uppity with the CIA. Now, this possibility has to be taken with the utmost seriousness. Trump has bucked the British establishment and their desire to continue every war they ever started by moving to end the conflict in the Ukraine without the involvement of Britain. And to that end, Trump just announced that he would be speaking with Putin, of course, and about stopping the bloodbath. Trump also deployed Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio to help defuse the recent escalation of military tensions between India and Pakistan. Although underlying issues haven't been resolved yet, at least they're not shooting missiles at each other. And he's also refused so far, Trump has also refused so far to launch a war against Iran, contrary to the insistence of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the neocons in the U.S. who have been behind Netanyahu's every bloody step of the way in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So whether or not Trump is going to finally decide to act to stop the horrors unfolding in Gaza remains an uncertainty, as he still has not taken the steps well within his power as of this day to stop the genocide. And what the British and their establishment allies are particularly worried about is that Trump, despite his imperfections, will take steps forward on the underlying decisive issue of reorienting the U.S. and world economy back to a productive basis, away from a slave-based basis. And in that new system, open up cooperations with nations which Comey and all of his ilk always deemed as eternal, in perpetuity, enemies of the United States, Russia and China. And this fear may be what was behind Moody's downgrading Friday of U.S. sovereign debt. I mean, was that kind of a shot across the bow of the financial markets to get Trump back in line? As the City of London recently promised before the January inauguration? Well, the stakes are high. What is known to even well-informed observers is possibly just the tip of the iceberg of what's really going on behind the scenes, which is deadly serious gravity of the Department of National Intelligence, Gabbard's response to Comey's threat. And she just flat out said that man belongs behind bars for his threat of assassination. And then to repeat myself, Trump said even a child knows what 8647 means. And when a former director of the FBI comes out and says that. So it's essential that not only the deep state permanent bureaucracy in Washington be dismantled, but more importantly, that their underlying policies for which they were established be abolished. So in the coming period of time, with the Schiller Institute's the international security and development architecture that they're calling for, I hope you'll listen to some of it. I hope you'll listen to some of their guests. But a little bit more about this assassination thing that's got me disturbed. In this devastating interview, May 15th, Thursday, with Fox News host Jesse Waters, Tulsi Gabbard just demolished the media line that former director James Comey was innocently exercising his right to free speech when he promoted the 8647 code being used in anti-Trump circles to call for the assassination of Trump. And Gabbard was warning that Comey's action reflects the intention of the establishment, which created his so-called stature. Now, if you saw it, it was done with seashells. And I don't know what the latest story is, but Comey was saying, well, he saw it on the beach and took a picture of it and thought it was interesting. Now, in mob circles, as I said earlier, to 86 someone means knocking someone off. You know, 20 miles out of town and 6 feet under. And Trump happens to be, of course, the 47th U.S. president. And for a former head of the FBI, a man who spent most of his career prosecuting mobsters and gangsters, people who know and execute other human beings, who 86 other human beings, who uses this exact lingo of 86 to claim that while he knew 86 had a political message, he had no idea it was associated with violence. How he could say that and maintain a straight face, I don't know. Comey knew that little over a month ago, an anti-Trump, anti-Musk group was proliferating this 8647 message, which is a veiled call to attempt to murder the President of the United States. And so on Jesse Waters, Gabbard was saying the dangerousness of this cannot be overestimated. There have been 2 attempts on the president's life already. And Comey, who has been celebrated by MSNBC, CNN, and the Democratic elite as a beacon of integrity, that law and order guy, this was the guy who was issuing a hit on the president. So this administration takes this very seriously. That the administration said through their spokesperson, it's guys like Comey and others who call the president the modern-day Nazi, people who are in positions of influence, who are saying that President Trump poses an existential threat to our country, who are seeking to remove the man by the American people elected to be president by other means. So Gabbard on Jesse Waters' program pointed to a Rutgers study issued a little over a month ago, which asked respondents what they thought of the calls for Trump to be assassinated, and found that 55% thought that murdering the president would be somewhat justified. I don't know. That's out of Rutgers. The report described an assassination culture beginning to take over the views of the extreme left, she said. This, she pointed out, reflects the effect of what people like Comey are putting out there. Therefore, she says, Comey must be held accountable for this, just as a man in Georgia who had been issuing threats on her life a month ago has now been indicted and jailed. And asked directly if she thought Comey should be behind the bars, her answer was, I do. People like him have to be held accountable given the stature from which the propaganda media has given him. She said, I am very concerned for the president's life. Well, I don't know if the phone meeting between Trump and Putin is underway yet, but Trump said this yesterday on Truth Social. I will be speaking by telephone to President Vladimir Putin of Russia on Monday at 10 a.m., which would have been 8 o'clock here. So maybe it's going on right now. The subjects of the call will be stopping the bloodbath that is killing on average more than 5,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers a week, and trade. And I will then be speaking to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and then with President Zelensky, various members of NATO, and hopefully it will be a productive day. A ceasefire will take place, and this very violent war, a war that should never have happened, will end. God bless us all. He says a ceasefire will take place. Now, a ceasefire to one person may not necessarily be the same ceasefire to somebody else. You know what I mean? You know, it's like the word peace. Peace to you, peace to me. When we talk of peace, we mean an absence of hostility, tranquility, life, liberty, and happiness. The ability to provide for you and your family without the threat of invasion or war or anything that would threaten the tranquility of the family setting. Now, peace to the far left, of course, means removing constitutional guarantees and replacing them with more of a communist model. Because to them, peace would be gained by the absence of freedom, the absence of guns, the absence of any weapons, the absence of any leaders that would lead you in revolt against the deep state. That's what they mean when they say peace. So when President Trump says a ceasefire will take place, what does he mean by that? Does he mean that as of today or tomorrow, Putin is finally going to say, all right, Donald, all right, Donald, you win, we'll stop firing for 30 days. What do we get in return? What would you possibly offer Putin in return for 30 days of ceasefire? So both sides can go out and find their dead in an area that's heavily mined, mind you. And while Russia is doing what they can to secure their positions during this 30-day ceasefire, what's the NATO stooges doing? The four stooges, Macron, Starmer, Merz, and Tusk. What are they doing? Well, they're sending in armament and artillery like crazy across the border during the 30-day ceasefire. So you know what Putin's going to do with that. So Trump's announcement followed a discussion between Secretary of State Rubio and Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov. And according to the Russian Foreign Ministry, this is Saturday, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had a telephone conversation with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio at the initiative of the U.S. side. The heads of foreign policy offices shared opinions on the outcomes of the Russian-Ukrainian talks held at the previous day in Istanbul. Marco Rubio welcomed the agreements reached on the exchange of prisoners of war and the intention of each side to prepare its own proposals outlining the conditions necessary for a ceasefire. He reaffirmed Washington's readiness to continue supporting efforts towards a negotiated settlement. Sergei Lavrov acknowledged the constructive role played by the United States encouraging Kyiv to finally accept President Putin's proposal to resume negotiations in Istanbul. He reiterated Moscow's willingness to continue working with the U.S. colleagues in this context. The conversation also touched on a number of other international and regional issues. The sides exchanged views on the continuation of American-Russian contracts. Now, the U.S. State Department, that was Russian. The U.S. State Department was a little more terse. The U.S. State Department said this: Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov today. Secretary Rubio welcomed the prisoner exchange agreement reached during the May 16th Ukraine-Russia talks in Istanbul and delivered President Trump's strong message. The United States is committed to achieving a lasting end to the Russian-Ukraine war. The comprehensive peace plan proposed by the United States outlines the best way forward. The Secretary emphasized President Trump's call for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the violence. Yeah, it's a little different. So Trump gave an interview to Fox News on Friday in which Trump was pressed about Putin not wanting to engage in talks on the Ukraine, and Trump said this: he is at the table and he wanted this meeting. I think Putin is tired of this whole thing. Then he reiterated that no breakthrough will occur without him. He said, I always felt that there can't be a meeting without me because I don't think a deal's going to get through. I have a very good relationship with Putin. I think we'll make a deal. We have to get together, and I think we'll probably schedule it. Then, when pressed again on whether he sees Putin as an obstacle to peace, Trump shifted the focus to Zelensky. He said, I had a real rough session with Zelensky because I didn't like what he said. He's not making this easy. He doesn't have the cards. Ukraine is fighting against a massive army, and he doesn't have the cards. Well, I think we'll hear something before too much of the rest of today is over with on the outcome of this conversation. I don't know, maybe they'll keep their mouths shut to some degree. I don't know. But I did want to say something about the IDF is their open campaign to conquer Gaza. And the Arab League, trying to delay this, is just urging action by the international community. Now, the Israeli Defense Forces announced late Friday night that the first phase of its so-called Gideon's Chariots, the operation had begun with intense airstrikes and ground forces moving in across Gaza. Now remember, Trump could stop this at any moment. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu had promised the IDF would move in and fully occupy Gaza as soon as President Trump was out of the Middle East. And that once in, no one will ever be able to stop this. We're going to get them this time. And the stated objective is to seize and retain total control of the Gaza territory, drive its inhabitants into a minuscule ghetto near the Egyptian border, where limited food would be distributed under Israeli military control until all, mind you, 1.5 million Palestinians are finally driven out of the Gaza Strip entirely. See, before, we always knew that that's what Netanyahu and Smotrich and Gvir and Gallant and the rest of that ilk, what their design was. And they would let third parties, newspaper releases, various diplomats hit of this and that. Now they're coming right out and saying it. We are going to drive the Palestinians out of the Gaza completely. He didn't say we're going to drive Hamas. He didn't say we're going to conquer Hamas. He didn't say we're sorry for the innocent Palestinians that Hamas is using as shields. They finally came out and admitted the game plan. Get rid of those dirty animal Palestinians. And so by the morning of Saturday, the Gaza Health Ministry reported that 146 Gazans were killed in the last 24 hours, and the IDF ground troops reportedly advancing toward Deir al-Balah in central Gaza, deploying heavy artillery fire and airstrikes to cover the advancing troops. Deir al-Balah, according to the Times of Israel, was one of the few areas of the Strip where Israeli ground troops had not entered since October 7, 2023. Intensive airstrikes were also reported Saturday in the areas of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza and Jabalia in the north. And inside Israel, leading family members of Israeli hostages just exploded at their government for launching this new invasion and endangering the lives of their loved ones who are still being held captive. And the outcries during the weekly Saturday night and anti-government protests were sharp. One of the parents of a son being held hostage in Gaza denounced Netanyahu as the angel of death. for her son and the others with his political war. Not everybody in Israel is supporting this. The majority of the population is. So the Arab League nations issued the final statement of the 34th Arab Summit at the end Saturday, which calls on the international community, especially influential countries, to assume their moral and legal responsibilities to pressure for an end to the bloodshed and to facilitate the swift entry of humanitarian aid into all the affected areas of Gaza, blah, 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 blah. What the Arab League should be doing is telling the truth in the sense, President Trump, you can stop this any minute. All you have to do is call Bibi. So these nations are urging political, financial, and legal support be provided for the Arab Islamic plan for the recovery and reconstruction of Gaza within a political process leading to Palestinian independence. They said any form of displacement, forced migration, or expulsion of Palestinians from their land are grave violations of international law, crimes against humanity, and acts of ethnic cleansing, condemning the policies of starvation and scorched earth aimed at forcing Palestinians to leave their land, end quote. So here you have the Arab League saying any form of displacement, any form of forced migration, any expulsion of Palestinians from their land, crimes against humanity. At the same time, the IDF is in there doing the very thing. So the Arab League is essentially describing what the IDF is doing, saying, that's bad. Jeez. And they have the power. They have the power to stop this. Is the power of the Israeli lobby in Washington really this strong? Is it true that Thomas Massey of Tennessee is the only member of the House of Representatives that does not have a member of the Israeli lobby as a part of their staff? Egyptian President al-Sisi, addressing the Arab League summit this weekend in Baghdad, called on President Trump to exert all necessary efforts and pressures to achieve a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Why do they do this? Why do they stand up and say inane things like this when they should be saying the truth? President Trump, you have the power to stop this destruction of humanity. You have the power to do it and the power to do it right now. But no. El-Sisi, who does not want to lose his position as Emperor of Egypt, says, we call on the United States to exert all necessary efforts and pressures to achieve a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And then we call upon President Trump to help bring a lasting peace in the region, as the United States has done in the past with Egypt and Israel in the 1970s. Jeez. I mean, were President Trump to achieve a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, that would pave the way, they said, el-Sisi said, for a serious political process in which he, Trump, would act as sponsor and mediator, leading to a final settlement achieving lasting peace akin to the historic role of the United States between Egypt and Israel in the 70s. Now, el-Sisi bluntly dismissed, however, any idea that the path to peace lies solely in Arab nations establishing relations with Israel. He said this, even if Israel succeeds in reaching normalization agreements with all Arab countries, a lasting peace, just and comprehensive peace in the Middle East will remain out of reach unless a Palestinian state is established as per international legitimacy resolutions. El-Sisi continues there. The Palestinians have endured systematic crimes and brutal practices aimed at obliterating and annihilating them, effectively ending their presence in the Gaza Strip over the last year. The Israeli war machine has left no stone unturned, showing no mercy to children or the elderly, employing starvation and the denial of health care as weapons and adopting destruction as a strategy. Then he described the displacement of 2 million Gazans within the Strip as a blatant defiance of international law. It is reported these repressive policies of killing and destruction being carried out likewise in the West Bank by the Israeli occupiers. Despite this, the Palestinian people must remain steadfast, resilient, and committed to their legitimate right to their land and homeland. What a bunch of crap. They're starving to death. How in the world can they maintain their legitimate right to land and homeland? Puke? Issue harsh language against the IDF? Puke on them when they're being shot? Oh, man, how do these people live with themselves? Well, easily. They want to maintain control and power. Nobody over there has anything good to say about the Palestinians except the Palestinians. The Egyptians don't want them. Even though Netanyahu and the boys just came out and said, we're going to force them down there into the Sinai. We're going to force them down in this little pocket of land on the Egyptian border. And if those Egyptians don't take them in, they're the bad guys. They didn't say that, but that's coming. Well, where's the God of the Palestinians in all of this? Well, where do I want to go here? We have, what, about 15 minutes left. This idea, I want to go back to the Ukraine for a moment. If I talk any more about Gaza, I'm going to start swearing. Because none of them are speaking the truth. They just aren't. You're not going to get the truth out of the U.S. State Department. You're not going to get the truth out of the Oval Office. You're not going to get the truth out of Israel. And unless you, and I'm not judging you by any means. Even my own hypocrisy knows no bounds. But if we, let me say this, me, you and me, if we aren't doing something on a regular basis, and I try to do this with my radio show, same thing can be done with emails, especially to the White House, doing something to bring this to an end. I can't help but believe the judgment from the throne of righteousness is only going to put up with this for so much longer. Now back to peacekeeping troops, which would, the Four Stooges are calling for ceasefire, and then following the ceasefire in the Ukraine, the implementation of peacekeeping troops. Peacekeeping troops, which would clearly not be peacekeeping troops, into the Ukraine, and then something happens, and then NATO's Article 5, or somehow the United States could be pulled into such a war. I don't think this is going to happen, but I think that if the Europeans, and especially the Germans, really would go in the direction of putting the Taurus into the Ukraine, Russia will react to that. Russia has already made it very clear. This is the red line of all red lines. And when you study the mindset and the determination of the Russians, which has been clearly available for anybody who wants to take a few moments to examine it over the last several years, Russia will react. And if they would, for example, if the use of the Taurus was to knock out the Kerch Bridge, there are a lot of bridges in Germany that can be taken out very easily with something far less than the equivalent of a Taurus. Or if the Russians were to take out the factory where the Taurus is being produced. Then I'm sure the Russians would absolutely send a signal that could not possibly be misunderstood. I think this is extremely dangerous because once you enter into such a situation, once that dynamic is started, these things can get out of control more quickly than you can twist your fingers. Remember that discussion, I've mentioned it before, from Hunt for Red October? About the middle of the movie, and the commander of the aircraft carrier is talking to one of his senior officers and talking about how this thing can get out of hand really quick. I thought that was explained very well. When these things get hot under the saddle, things can get out of control really quick. All right, now to finish some thoughts here. Back on April 25th, and I know I keep popping back and forth between different subjects because I keep thinking of different things. Trump said, "It's not my war," referring to Ukraine. He said that on board Air Force One on April 25th. What's that, about 3 weeks ago? And Trump has repeatedly said that the Ukraine war is Joe Biden's war, not his. But in all honesty, the Ukraine war now belongs to Trump. He can no longer deny ownership because he has the power to stop it. And just think about this. Just like he can stop the genocide in Gaza with a phone call to Netanyahu, pull your damn troops out and send in the humanitarian aid. And if you don't, the hell you're expecting me to rain down on Iran will come down on you. He could do that, but he won't. And he could do the same thing with the Ukraine. He could stop the flow of money and the flow of armament by just calling the Pentagon and say, "Stop it. Stop it right now." Now, he no longer can deny ownership of the Ukrainian war because he has the power to stop it. Now, this is from defenseblog.com. President Donald Trump's administration has reportedly approved its first weapons sale to the Ukraine since the start of his second term, with plans to authorize direct commercial exports valued at $50 million or more. The move was first reported by Kyiv Post, citing diplomatic sources, later confirmed through congressional records. According to the report, the U.S. administration formally notified Congress on April 30 of its intention to allow the sale of military goods to the Ukraine under the Direct Commercial Sales Program. This mechanism permits U.S. defense companies to negotiate arms exports directly with foreign governments, pending approval from the Senate Department. Kyiv Post said the proposed sale will include military designated goods, bombs and bullets, I guess, technical data, and related defense services. The approval was made under the Arms Export Control Act, which mandates notification to Congress for defense sales exceeding certain thresholds. Additionally, confirmation came from European Pravda, which cited documentation available on the U.S. Congress website. A record listed an entry dated April 29, cataloged as EC 859, referencing a memo from the State Department's legal office to the House Affairs Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee. This transaction represents the first defense-related export authorization to Ukraine under President Trump's current administration. And what's he sending? Military designated goods, technical data, and related defense services. And I don't know if he's still on the phone with Putin right now or if they ever had the phone conversation or not. 3 weeks ago, Trump made the Ukraine war his war by authorizing the continuation of what Biden was doing before him. And now he's expecting to have an intelligent conversation with Putin. Putin says there will be no ceasefire. I'm glad to sit down and talk. Bring in your Kyiv people. Bring in that clown idiot Zelensky if you want. But remember who won this war. And if I have to prove the point by going to the Dnieper, I'll do it. If I have to pass over the Dnieper, I'll do it. Now, I'm putting words in his mouth, but he and Lavrov and Gerasimov and Zarakova and some of the others have said essentially the same thing. Now, by the same token, as I said earlier, the Israeli genocide in Gaza is now Trump's genocide. The man who was elected on the promise of ending America's stupid wars, he called them, is neck deep in the continuation and escalation of these wars. And the only reason he stopped the attack on the Yemenis is because the Yemenis was winning. Was winning. They were very effective in their drone bombing of Haifa and Tel Aviv. And they were very effective in hitting ships in the Persian Gulf. And so we had to stop the attack on the Yemenis because they were hurting American and other corporate interests, especially China's. And now, Trump's presidential race promise to end America's stupid wars are now his. The genocide and the Ukrainian, which is almost genocidal. So, per Trump's wars on behalf of Israel, this report just came out from the Israeli news site Ynet. The Israeli military is set to receive a major new weapons shipment from the U.S. in the coming weeks to help prepare it for continued operations in Gaza and a potential attack on Iran. The details of the arms shipment are unclear, but Ynet said it would include 3,000 munitions for Israeli Air Force. The report said that the bomb shipment was recently approved by the Trump administration. The Pentagon's Defense Corporation Agency said on Monday that the State Department approved a $180 million arms deal for ITAN Power Pack engines that will go to Israel, but it will not announce any new bomb shipments. The Ynet report said that the new weapons shipment will prepare Israel's military for the new large-scale campaign in Gaza, and that it comes in addition to over 10,000 munitions that are expected to replenish Israeli stockpiles soon. The Trump administration has approved a series of arms deals and weapons shipment for Israel, totaling more than $12 billion. including tens of thousands of 2,000-pound bombs, which Israel has dropped on densely populated civilian areas of Gaza. Besides fueling Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, the U.S. military aid to Israel also supports Israel's stepped-up military operations in the West Bank and its occupations of southern Lebanon and southern Syria. Just a little more here. Beyond that, Trump extended the U.S. war in the Middle East to include Yemen. However, after spending over $1 billion in bombs and military operations and losing 3 F/A-18 jet fighters surrounding our attacks on the Houthis, with the result of doing nothing to dismantle their ability to continue launching missiles against Israel in defense of the Palestinian people, but killing scores of innocent Yemeni civilians, our Navy warships were forced to leave harm's way, giving Yemen a huge victory and utterly humiliating Trump and the neocon Zionists in D.C. Excuse me, just a little dry here. Now, isn't this great? This is so after all of this, Trump did what he always does, telling America that he cut a great deal with Yemen after that country begged him to stop shelling them and promised not to launch their missiles anymore against Israeli targets. The truth is, from my sources, Yemen said no such thing. The U.S. Navy got its tail whipped and was forced to leave the area or risk suffering much greater death and damage. And this is seen by the fact that the Houthis have continued launching missiles against Israeli targets and said that they will continue to do so until the genocide stops. Well, that should do it for today. This is the 19th of May. I appreciate your listenership, and for those of you on the stream, thank you for being there and being a part of the program. As far as, you can always post comments, but I don't see any. Tomorrow, of course, the focus, I'm already off the air at K-Talk, or the second program has started. For those of you on the stream, tomorrow's program, of course, will be reporting on the meeting today between Trump and Putin. Radio files, documents. So I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Thank you all for being a part of this. If you can, boy, am I orange or what? What's happened here? If you can subscribe, like, do whatever it does to help build a bigger audience, I would just most sincerely appreciate it. My goal is to get up to 1,000 subscriptions, the most of which listen to this broadcast later in the day. Some listen live in the morning, but most of them listen later on when they have time. But changes are coming, and I think we're going to have a better program all the time. But I'm going to go ahead and end the stream, and I will see you all tomorrow.